In this video, we'll be talking about the male reproductive system, its anatomy, and how it works, the physiology of the system as well. To get started here, we want to talk about some basic functions and introduce a few terms. One of those terms is what's called a gamete. A gamete is another word for a sex cell. So sex cells in males are the sperm cells, and sex cells in females are the egg cells, also called an ovum. So both males and females make and deliver gametes to a certain location. And here are some other similarities we'll talk about. So each sex has a pair of what are called gonads. Gonads are the organs that make these sex cells, that produce gametes. And we'll talk about, for males and females, what those gonads are. Additionally, there's a system of ducts. Ducts is a fancy word for tubes, like you have air ducts in the ceiling. And these ducts are going to either store and or transport gametes to a different location. And then lastly, there are various structures that enable and facilitate sexual intercourse to occur. Another word for sexual intercourse is copulation. That's sort of a more formal term for that. So those are some commonalities. Now let's focus on the male system itself. So what this cartoon here is talking about is this process called circumcision. I'm guessing that most of us know what circumcision is, but just in case, we're going to go ahead and go through it. Circumcision is the process by which this layer of skin that mostly covers the head of the penis, called foreskin, is removed. Sometimes this is done early on in life, like shortly after birth. Other times it's done a little bit later. It's believed to be easier to do it earlier, partially because the child, they believe, will not remember that experience and the pain will be fleeting. However, there's different schools of thought. As far as why this process is done, well, a lot of it has to do with cultural or religious factors. Sort of traditionally, it's been done in certain cultures. And there is some evidence that by removing the foreskin, you reduce the chance of getting sexually transmitted infections or spreading sexually transmitted infections. It also might reduce the chance of getting urinary tract infections. And the reason for that is with the foreskin still intact, a male has to be sure to pull that foreskin back, wash underneath it, and let it dry out each time they bathe. Otherwise, bacteria and other things could get trapped under the foreskin, then increasing the chance of passing that bacteria either on to somebody else or getting, like I said, a urinary tract infection. However, opponents of this process argue that it's a cruel thing to do. You're cutting off a portion of the penis, this little covering of skin, and this covering of skin does have some nerve endings in it. So by removing it, you are reducing some of the sensation. It's also a painful process, even though it's fast, for an infant to go through. So again, two schools of thought. Now, this slide here is an overview of the internal structures that make up the male system. We'll go through one at a time and talk about each of these, but you can always come back to this slide later and use it as a review tool. So first of all, there's a difference between what's called semen and sperm. Sperm, these are the gametes, the sex cells for males. Semen is a fluid with other things in it that usually contains sperm. When it comes out of the body, usually that semen contains sperm. And we'll talk about each of these different structures here that are involved in making and transporting sperm and semen as well. Sperm production occurs inside the testes, and we'll be more specific than that. But there's a structure that surrounds the testes, this sac, called the scrotum. Does anybody know what the scrotum does? Well, the scrotum helps to regulate temperature. Put temp for short. Inside the testes. And the reason this is important is because sperm production requires a slightly lower temperature. So to make sperm, the conditions must be a little bit cooler than the rest of the body, just very slightly, like a degree or two. And by having the testes outside of the body cavity, hanging down in this sac, that allows for the heat to escape more, and the male regulates that via the scrotum. So what happens is, let's say it's a hot day or a man's exercising. What happens is the muscles in the scrotum will relax, allowing the testes to move further down, away from the body. That then prevents them from getting as warm. They can remove more heat that way. Oppositely, if it's cold, that scrotum will pull up to pull the testes closer to the body so they don't get too cold. So you can think of it kind of like the balls elevator, right? Pulling up, moving down to regulate temperature, because it needs to be slightly lower than normal body temperature for sperm to be made and be functional. So here we're going to go through this step by step, the different parts of the internal male anatomy and what they do. So number 1 down here, down in the right-hand corner, seminiferous tubule. So I said sperm production occurs inside the testes. More specifically, it starts inside the seminiferous tubules, these squiggly little tubes that are found inside the testes. Next, from the seminiferous tubules, sperm moves into the structure on top of the testes. That structure is called the epididymis. The epididymis is where that sperm matures, so it enables it to swim properly. And then it stays there and is stored there, and it only is removed from there if the male is stimulated. And then that epididymis will contract to push that sperm into the next location. So upon sufficient stimulation, mature sperm is sent out of the epididymis into the vas deferens, this long tube that moves up and goes back down on both sides here. Right there, sorry. If stimulation continues, reaches the ejaculatory duct next. Right around that location, you're going to have these 3 different glands: seminal vesicle, prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland. Those 3 glands are all going to add different secretions, proteins, sugars, a slightly basic fluid to help neutralize the acidity of the vagina. And adding all these different fluids are going to support that sperm. So the sugar, for example, will be used by the mitochondria in the sperm to power its swimming and, all the metabolic stuff that goes on inside that sperm. At this point, we no longer call it just sperm. Now all these secretions have been added. Now it's referred to as semen. And so if stimulation continues, now that semen is pushed into the urethra, number 5 right here. The urethra is a shared tube for both urine and semen, but not at the same time. And so that semen, usually containing sperm, gets propelled through the urethra and out of the penis. That's called ejaculation, which we'll talk about later. In addition, before ejaculation occurs, there's a fluid that comes out before the semen, and that fluid is referred to as pre-ejaculate. Pre-ejaculate helps to clean out the urethra to remove nitrogen wastes and make sure it's ready for that semen to pass through. So we said that the male gamete is a sperm cell, and it's made from a body cell, dividing a body cell. So within the testes, body cells are going to divide via meiosis. Meiosis is where a cell divides into two cells. They are not identical. They have half of the genetic information of the original. And with half of the genetic information, that means that sperm cells have 23 chromosomes instead of the usual 46 chromosomes you'd find within body cells. The process by which sperm are made is called spermatogenesis. Genesis is to make, to create, to form. So to form sperm, or spermatozoa more formally. And just reminding us that human body cells have 46 chromosomes normally. So I'm going to show you guys a video on the next slide talking about how sperm swim. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about the different parts of the sperm here. This is the head of the sperm. Head of the sperm contains, so the head contains DNA, but also enzymes that will help it get into the egg. It's hard to see in this picture. We'll see it better, I think, in the video. But the next region is going to be called the mid piece. And the mid piece contains mitochondria. So that means that's where the sugar that was produced by those accessory glands into the semen is going to be used in cellular respiration then to make ATP that the cell can use. And then the rest of the sperm, the long part here, that is the tail, which is a single flagellum. I call it flagellum is singular, but one flagella for movement. And so let's take a look at a video here that will show us sperm moving or swimming under a microscope. So you can see how they actually use those flagella to move. And that's what that link was on the previous page as well. I'll skip ahead here a little bit. So you can see they're swimming and ripping the tail back and forth, kind of like a snake moves, but much faster. This video is showing a number of deformities as well. Alright, so you can watch more of that video if you'd like to on your own, but yeah, they swim kind of like a snake, wiggling back and forth. So please take a minute to pause the video, read the question, come up with your answer, and we'll come back and talk about it. So this question is asking, where is mature sperm stored prior to ejaculation? So this is a recall question from earlier in this video. Let's take a look. The epididymis. The epididymis lies on top of the testes. It's where sperm actually mature and are stored until they get released. So sperm can't get released, though, until something else happens. As you can see here, if you're not familiar, this is from the movie Anchorman. An erection must occur. So let's talk about how an erection develops. So there are kind of three general steps. On the next slide, I'll go ahead and have these written out for you as well. There's also a little video over here that you can watch that will talk more about this process. But first of all, there are arteries that supply blood to the penis. Under most cases, when the penis is not erect, it's flaccid instead, like this. These arteries are relatively small. You have enough blood flow to keep the tissues alive, but not extensive blood flow. What happens, though, is when a man gets aroused, those arteries will dilate. By dilating, they get wider. That's what that means. And then that causes increased blood flow to come through those arteries. Step 2. Blood moves into this spongy tissue surrounding those arteries. You can see here there's not much blood in those, but here a lot of blood has moved into those spongy tissues, causing them to swell up or fill up with blood. That causes the penis then to become erect. So an erection is just due to a massive amount of blood being stored in the penis, kind of like a water balloon being filled up with a liquid. And then 3 isn't how the erection develops, it's how the erection is more maintained. So up here we have the flaccid penis that's not erect, the blood coming in and the blood going out are balanced. What happens is when you have increased blood flow and more blood that's filling up this spongy tissue, it squishes the veins, it compresses the veins that would drain blood from the penis, and so it slows the rate of blood leaving there. That helps to maintain that erection. That's what we've got here. Arteries that bring blood into the penis dilate. That increases blood flow going into that organ. Blood accumulates in the spongy tissue. That causes the penis to become erect. And then the veins that are going to be taking that blood away from the penis, they get squished or compressed. It helps to keep blood there for a longer period of time, helping to maintain that erection. One thing I want to talk about is erectile dysfunction drugs. Erectile dysfunction drugs work by causing arteries to dilate, so it increases blood flow into the penis. And you definitely do not want to use an erectile dysfunction drug unless you need one. Because if you do, and your erection lasts for too long, in the commercials that advertise this, they say something like, if your erection lasts for more than 4 hours, see a doctor. That's because when blood stays too long in any one place, there's a greater chance of harmful blood clots forming. And if blood clots form and they cut off blood supply to the penis, it's going to lead to the death of that organ or starting to die. And in some cases, people have had to have their penis amputated because of that. So don't risk it. Don't use those drugs unless you need it for a medical reason. So that was an erection. Now we'll talk about the next step. The next step is ejaculation. Ejaculation is a bunch of muscle contractions. And those muscle contractions are going to start here in the epididymis, where that mature sperm is stored. It's going to push that sperm into the vas deferens. The vas deferens are then going to contract. They'll get up here to the ejaculatory duct, those 3 glands, seminal vesicle, prostate gland, bulbourethral, will all add fluids. Now we have semen. Now the urethra will contract to push that fluid out of the penis. That's called ejaculation, that whole process in order. So here it says at ejaculation, approximately 300 million sperm cells. We'll say something like 40 to 500 million per ejaculate. That's kind of the normal range. So in a single ejaculate, that's how many sperm are released. A huge, huge amount. However, out of all the stuff that comes out of that semen, these 40 to 500 million sperm, this equals less than 5% of the volume of ejaculate. So most of what comes out is actually those fluids and stuff that were added by those 3 glands. The sperm itself is very, very small, each cell. So even though there's millions and millions of them, they make up a very small volume of that. And we'll talk later about what's called the withdrawal or the pull-out method that requires a male to be able to essentially hold back that erection, or sorry, not that erection, to hold back ejaculation. And the way a male is able to do that is because of the presence of these sphincter muscles. So sphincter muscles, remember, are circular muscles that help to close off an opening to regulate what's passing through. And so you can prevent, if you have a strong enough sphincter muscle, that semen from continuing to pass out through the urethra. However, once it gets into the urethra, unless you physically clamp off the penis, now you're at a point of no return. It's important to note that sphincters regulate the passage of that semen through, but they are not actually contracting to push the semen along. They're just the gates that are closed or relaxed. Remember before how I said that urine and semen both come out through the urethra, but not at the same time? That's because when the urethra is contracting to push that semen out, the sphincter that is closing off between the bladder, up here is the urinary bladder, and the urethra, that is closed off so that urine can't come out. I think this is the last question, and I believe this topic is finished. So go ahead, pause the video, read through it, come up with an answer, and we'll discuss it. Okay, so the key to this is remembering that blood flow into the penis is what causes an erection. And so we can cross off this whole nerve thing. It's got nothing to do with it. Thickening of the blood as it cools, also not related to it. Dilation of veins draining the penis. Well, if those veins were dilated, that would mean you'd have more blood leaving the penis, which might make the erection not last as long. But you wouldn't expect dilation when the weather's cold. You expect constriction. So down here, D, when it's cold, you have reduced blood flow to your extremities, the outer parts of your body, and then that helps to keep the heat more in the body. All right, that finishes up this topic.